"You can't own that lake." Those were the very first words I heard after moving into what I thought would be my dream home. Imagine this. Boxes still stacked in the living room, my coffee machine barely unpacked, and me standing on the front porch with a mug in hand, ready to enjoy my first peaceful morning. I was looking out over the calm water that glistened in the sunlight, feeling like I had finally escaped the chaos of city life. Then suddenly, like something out of a bad sitcom, a group of people marched up my driveway as if they were on some official mission. There were 5 of them, all middle-aged, dressed like they had somewhere important to be, even though it was only 9 in the morning. One had a clipboard, another had a stack of papers tucked under her arm, and leading the pack was a tall man with slicked-back hair who looked like he took himself way too seriously. Later I learned his name was Dale, the president of the HOA. At that moment, though, all I knew was that he was pointing his finger at my backyard lake as if it was stolen property. "You can't own that lake," he repeated, in a tone that carried both disbelief and arrogance. "It belongs to the community. You'll need to grant us access immediately." I blinked at him, stunned, then glanced back at the lake that was literally outlined in the property deed I had just signed. The realtor had made it very clear during the sale. The lake was privately owned, not part of the HOA, not shared, not regulated by anyone but me. That exclusivity was the very reason I had chosen the place. A peaceful house, complete privacy, and yes, my own lake. It was supposed to be a dream come true, I tried to answer calmly. Actually, that lake came with the property. It's part of my deed. It's not under HOA control. The group exchanged skeptical glances like I was a child trying to claim I'd invented fire. Dale let out a dry laugh, one of those condescending chuckles that make you want to roll your eyes. "We'll see about that," he said smugly, folding his arms. "You might think you own it, but our community has been using that lake for years. That makes it common property." For a moment, I thought maybe I had misheard. Did he really just say that because people used the lake, it magically belonged to them? I opened my mouth to explain again, but before I could, one of the women on his team stepped forward, waving her papers around like they were holy scripture. "Our HOA rules clearly state that the lake is a shared amenity," she declared. That's when my patience started wearing thin. I had spent months searching for this house, days going through contracts and hours reviewing every single clause in the paperwork before signing. I knew for a fact that the lake was mine. Yet here I was, not even 24 hours after moving, in being confronted by a group of strangers demanding control of something they didn't own. I took a deep breath and repeated, slower this time. "The lake is not part of your HOA. It is private property and it belongs to me. Period." The silence that followed was thick with tension. You could almost feel the entitlement radiating off them. Dale smirked, tilting his head like he'd just been challenged to a game he thought he couldn't lose. "We'll see," he said again, this time with a sharp edge to his voice. Then, without another word, the group turned and marched back down my driveway as if they'd already decided this was going to be a war. I stood there frozen for a few seconds, coffee forgotten in my hand, watching their cars drive away. The peaceful morning I had imagined had been completely shattered. Instead of enjoying the sound of birds and the shimmer of water, all I could hear was the echo of Dale's words. "You can't own that lake." Right then and there, I knew my dream of quiet lakeside living had just taken a sharp turn into something else entirely. This wasn't going to be the calm retreat I had planned. No, this was going to be a battle. And deep down, even though I didn't know the full extent of it yet, I had the strangest feeling I wasn't the one who was going to lose. Over the next few days, the situation escalated faster than I could have imagined. At first, I thought maybe that morning confrontation was just bluster, an attempt by the HOA to intimidate me, scare me into handing over rights I didn't owe them. I figured once they realized I wasn't backing down, they'd move on and leave me alone. But I couldn't have been more wrong. By the end of the week, I found the first letter taped to my front door. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, bold fonts everywhere, written in the kind of language that tried to sound professional but really just came off as aggressive. The letter accused me of unlawful restriction of community amenities, and warned that if I didn't comply with their rules, I would be fined heavily and possibly face legal consequences. They gave me 10 days to respond. I remember holding the letter in my hands, shaking my head in disbelief. Unlawful restriction? What were they even talking about? I didn't restrict anything. I simply owned what was mine. And as for their fines, how could they possibly fine me when I wasn't even part of their HOA? It was absurd, but the letters kept coming. Every other day, a new envelope would show up in my mailbox or on my doorstep. Each one piled on more demands. They wanted me to sign a document granting the HOA permanent access rights to the lake. They wanted me to agree to let them maintain the docks that were already there, as if they weren't sitting illegally on my property. One letter even went so far as to say that if I didn't cooperate, they would take steps to secure access on behalf of the community. That one chilled me, because it sounded like they were threatening to trespass. The most ridiculous part of all this, the very docks they were fighting for were built on my land without permission. When I bought the property, the realtor had explained that years ago, before anyone really kept track of boundaries, some of the neighbors had extended their docks a little too far. Technically, every single dock that reached into my lake was trespassing. Still, I hadn't planned on causing trouble over it. I was fine letting people keep their docks as long as everyone respected the fact that the lake wasn't common property. But the HOA didn't just want to keep what they had. They wanted total control. At night, I sat at my kitchen table with the property deed spread out in front of me, reading every line over and over. The words were crystal clear. The lake, the shoreline, and even a buffer zone around it were part of my private land. I had every legal right to decide who used it and under what conditions. The HOA's claims were nothing but empty threats. Still, the constant pressure started to eat at me. What if they did drag me into court? Even if I was right, lawsuits could take years, and I didn't have unlimited money to burn on legal fees. What if they harassed me so much that living here became unbearable? Was I really prepared to fight an entire association just to keep something I'd already bought and paid for? I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a few sleepless nights over it. But every time doubt crept in, I pictured the smug expression on Dale's face when he said, "We'll see about that." That image alone was enough to steel my resolve. I wasn't about to let people like him push me around, and then came the kicker. The HOA tried to issue me a fine. Yes, a fine. A letter showed up saying I owed them $500 for non-compliance with community bylaws regarding shared amenities. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. How could they possibly think they had the authority to fine someone who wasn't even part of their organization? It was like me sending a bill to my neighbor for mowing my own lawn. Completely absurd. That night I started a folder. I put every single letter inside, neatly labeled by date. If they wanted a fight, I was going to be prepared. I also called a real estate attorney the next day, just to be sure I wasn't missing anything. After a quick review of my deed and the letters, the attorney confirmed exactly what I already knew. The HOA had no power over me, and their threats were empty. In fact, he pointed out that if I wanted to, I could sue them for harassment, or even for trespassing given the dock situation. The thought of turning the tables on them was tempting. But at that point, I wasn't looking for a fight. All I wanted was to be left alone to enjoy my lake. Unfortunately, that wasn't in the HOA's playbook. Their goal wasn't to negotiate or compromise, it was to intimidate. They thought if they made enough noise, I'd cave. What they didn't realize was that every new letter, every false threat, and every ridiculous demand only made me more determined to stand my ground. They were pushing me into a corner, and soon they were going to regret it. Because if they wanted to play this game, I had the winning card sitting in my folder, the property deed that proved the lake was mine. And I was ready to use it. It didn't take long before the entire neighborhood knew about the so-called lake dispute. At first, I thought the HOA would keep it behind closed doors, maybe whisper about me among themselves while they figured out their next move. But no, Dale and his crew made sure my name was on everyone's lips. One Saturday morning, While I was cleaning out the garage, I noticed neighbors slowing their cars as they drove past, glancing at me like I was some kind of outlaw. A woman I hadn't even met yet walked her dog right up to my driveway, shook her head and muttered under her breath, "Greedy." A couple of kids riding their bikes yelled, "That's not your lake! You stole it!" before speeding off laughing. It would have been comical if it hadn't felt so personal. The rumor mill was clearly running on overdrive. From what I gathered, the HOA had been spinning their own version of the story, painting me as the villain who had swooped in and taken something that belonged to the whole community. They left out the inconvenient detail that the lake had never been theirs to begin with. The tension only grew when the HOA escalated their tactics. One afternoon, I found another notice shoved under my door. This time, it wasn't about granting access. No, this one accused me of endangering community property. According to them, by not allowing the HOA to maintain the docks, I was putting people at risk of injury. It was laughable, really. Those docks had been sitting there for years, unregulated, unpermitted, and built without my consent. If anyone was in danger, it was because the HOA let homeowners slap together whatever wooden planks they wanted, without bothering to check boundaries or safety codes. But they weren't trying to be reasonable. They were trying to make me look like the bad guy. And to be honest, it was working. I remember one particular evening when I went down to the water to fish. It was supposed to be relaxing, the kind of quiet break I'd always dreamed of when I bought the property. Instead, I felt eyes on me from across the lake. A group of neighbors had gathered on their back porch, drinks in hand, whispering and pointing in my direction. Every time I reeled in the line, their whispers grew louder. Eventually, one man shouted across the water, "How does it feel owning something that doesn't belong to you?" I tried to ignore it, but inside I was boiling. I had done nothing wrong, yet somehow, I was being cast as the selfish outsider ruining the community's tradition. The final straw came at the community meeting the HOA insisted I attend. At first, I wasn't going to bother, but after weeks of being painted as the neighborhood villain, I decided it was time to defend myself. When I walked into the clubhouse, all eyes turned toward me. Some looked curious, others cold, and a few downright hostile. Dale was standing at the front, chest puffed out like a politician. He started the meeting with a dramatic speech declaring that our beloved community lake was under threat because of a single selfish homeowner. He spoke about family barbecues, kids learning to swim, neighbors celebrating holidays, all centered around our lake. He made it sound like I had stormed in and stolen a piece of their history. People clapped. A few even shouted, "Tell him, Dale." When he was finished, I raised my hand. Calmly, I walked to the front of the room. I could feel the weight of 100 eyes on me, some filled with anger, some with curiosity. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I had been carefully keeping. I held up the deed for everyone to see. "This," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "is the property deed. The lake and shoreline are part of my private property. It has never belonged to the HOA. It has never belonged to the community. It is mine." A hush fell over the room. Some people looked confused. Others glanced at each other nervously as if they were realizing they had been misled. I continued, "And while you may have built docks here without permission, the truth is, every single one of those docks sits on my land, which means, technically, I control them, not the HOA. The silence was deafening. Dale's face went pale, and for once, he didn't have a smug comeback. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Wait, is that true?" Another person demanded, "Did the board know this all along?" I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The deed in my hand said more than any speech I could. I simply finished with, "I'm not here to take anything away from anyone. I just won't be bullied into giving up what's rightfully mine." And then I walked back to my seat, leaving the weight of my words hanging in the air. That night I knew the battle lines had been drawn. The HOA had tried to paint me as the villain, but now the truth was out in the open. And judging by the uneasy faces I saw leaving that meeting, Dale and his board had a lot of explaining to do. What I didn't realize at the time, though, was that the power dynamics of the whole neighborhood had just shifted. And this was only the beginning. After that meeting, everything changed. The tension that had been bubbling quietly in the background finally exploded, but not in the way the HOA expected. Up until then, most of the neighbors had trusted Dale and the board's word without question. They believed the lake was community property because that's what they had always been told. But now, with the deed in black and white staring them in the face, cracks began to form in the HOA's armor. The days following the meeting were almost surreal. I'd be out mowing the lawn or fixing something around the house, and neighbors who had once glared at me started hesitantly approaching. Some came with apologies. One woman admitted, "I honestly thought you were trying to shut everyone out. Dale said you were planning to fence the lake off completely." Another man shook his head and muttered, "Figures. They've been lying to us for years." It wasn't universal, of course. There were still a few die-hard HOA loyalists who looked at me with open hostility. To them, I was the intruder who had ruined their traditions. But the majority? They were starting to see that the real villain wasn't me. It was the HOA board that had fed them half-truths and outright lies. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I had leverage. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was exposing the people who had been bullying the entire neighborhood. That realization gave me confidence, and I decided it was time to stop playing defense. I called a meeting of my own. Not in the HOA's stuffy clubhouse, but right on my dock by the water, HOA. I invited anyone who wanted to come hear the truth about the property lines and the docks. I laid out everything: the surveys, the maps, the deed, and even a statement from my lawyer confirming what I had said at the meeting. People listened, carefully, nodding, whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward the board members who had reluctantly shown up. When I finished, I told them I wasn't interested in cutting anyone off from the lake. "I'm not here to play gatekeeper," I explained. "If you want to fish, swim, or kayak, that's fine with me. But I won't hand control of my property to the HOA. Instead, I'm willing to make agreements with you directly. That way, there's no middleman and no false promises." That's when I revealed something that made a few jaws drop. Every dock they had built technically belonged to me now. "You have two choices," I said. "You can keep your dock and sign a simple agreement with me. Just a small maintenance fee so we can make sure the shoreline stays safe. Or, if you don't want to deal with me, you'll have to remove the dock entirely." The room, or rather the lakeside, went quiet. A few people looked shocked. Others seemed almost relieved. It was clear they'd grown tired of the HOA's nonsense and actually preferred the idea of a straightforward deal with me, instead of paying endless fees to a board that never seemed to fix anything. The HOA, however, was furious. Dale's face turned beet red and he practically shouted, "You can't just cut us out like that. This isn't how it works." But the truth was, that was exactly how it worked. I didn't need the HOA's permission to set terms for my own land. And deep down he knew it. That's when I dropped the final bombshell. Calmly, I said, "And if the HOA wants to challenge me in court, I'll be forced to countersue for trespassing. Because let's be clear, every dock that extends into this lake is an unapproved structure built on private property. My property." The look on Dale's face was priceless. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. His fellow board members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their leader had dragged them into a fight they couldn't possibly win. Word spread quickly after that meeting. Homeowners who had once sided with the HOA started asking pointed questions. "Why didn't you tell us the lake wasn't ours? Why did you make us believe we had rights we never had?" The board's credibility crumbled overnight. Dale, once so confident and smug, now found himself cornered. People weren't applauding him anymore. They were demanding answers. The more the board tried to spin the story, the worse it got. Neighbors began rallying behind me, not because they wanted to rebel, but because they realized I was the only one offering transparency. For the first time in years, they saw an alternative to the HOA's constant control and manipulation. Power shift was undeniable. The board had come after me with the intent of forcing me into submission. Instead, they had exposed their own weakness. All I had done was stand my ground, tell the truth, and back it up with evidence. By the end of the month, the HOA was in shambles. Their threats had lost all bite. Their fines, meaningless. Their authority, questioned at every turn. Dale looked like a man unraveling, barking orders that no one cared to follow anymore, and me, I sat on my dock in the evenings, fishing pole in hand, watching the sunset ripple across the water, knowing that for once, I wasn't just the owner of the lake, I was the one holding all the cards. The weeks that followed were almost like watching a slow-motion collapse. The HOA, once so loud and intimidating, now moved like a wounded animal trying to find its footing. Their letters stopped coming, their empty fines disappeared, and the board meetings that used to draw a crowd suddenly looked half-empty. The neighborhood had changed and everyone could feel it. One by one, residents started approaching me directly. At first, they were cautious, almost embarrassed, like kids caught sneaking candy. They'd knock on my door or catch me by the lake and ask, "So how does this agreement thing work? Do we just talk to you?" Some were worried I'd be strict, but when I explained my system, simple, fair, and transparent, they relaxed. It wasn't complicated. If they wanted to keep their dock, all I asked was a small maintenance fee and a promise to treat the lake respectfully. No hidden fines, no endless rules, no random inspections, just common sense. To my surprise, people embraced it. They liked dealing with a neighbor instead of a faceless board. One man laughed and said, "You're easier to work with than the HOA ever was. At least you actually pick up the phone." Word spread quickly, and soon almost every homeowner around the lake had struck a deal with me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The HOA had spent weeks trying to seize control of my property, and now I was the one setting the terms for half the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the board was unraveling. Dale, once the loud, smug president, couldn't escape the backlash. Homeowners cornered him at meetings, demanding answers. "Did you know we didn't own the lake? Why did you lie to us?" His responses were clumsy, defensive, and full of excuses. The more he tried to talk his way out of it, the clearer it became that he had gambled on bullying me into submission and lost. Eventually, the pressure got too much. Word came through the grapevine that Dale had resigned. Just like that, the man who had stormed onto my property, barking demands like he owned the place, was gone. The board scrambled to replace him, but the damage was already done. Their credibility had been shattered. I'll never forget the day one of the new board members, a woman named Susan, stopped by my house. She looked exhausted, like she'd aged 10 years in a single month. "We're not here to fight you anymore," she said plainly. "The community wants peace. Honestly, most of us are just tired of the drama." Peace. That was all I had wanted from the very beginning. I nodded and told her, as long as the HOA leaves me and my property alone, I won't cause any trouble. She seemed relieved, maybe even grateful, before walking back up the road. From then on, things really did change. The hostility melted away. Neighbors waved when they saw me fishing. Families still gathered on their docks for cookouts and swimming. And no one looked at me like I was the villain anymore. In fact, a few thanked me privately for standing up to the HOA, saying they had wanted to for years, but never had the nerve. It felt strange, almost surreal, going from the neighborhood outcast to the person who had quietly leveled the playing field for everyone. And in the middle of it all, the lake remained exactly what I had always wanted it to be: peaceful. In the evenings, I'd sit at the edge of the dock, watching the water ripple under the sunset, finally able to enjoy the quiet without the constant anxiety of what letter might show up in my mailbox next. The funny thing is, if the HOA had approached me differently from the start, if they'd asked politely, respected my ownership, maybe suggested a fair compromise, I probably would have been open to working with them. I had no desire to be the bad guy. But instead, they stormed in like bullies, full of arrogance and entitlement, convinced they could scare me into handing over what I had rightfully bought. That arrogance became their undoing. Looking back, the whole ordeal taught me something important. People like Dale, people who thrive on intimidation and control, only have power as long as others let them. The moment you stand up to them with the truth, their authority crumbles. All it took was a deed, a little backbone, and a refusal to be bullied. And now, not only do I still have my lake, but I also have the satisfaction of knowing the HOA lost its grip over the entire neighborhood because of their own lies. So when people ask me how I handled it, I tell them this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't yelling, fighting, or throwing punches. Sometimes it's standing calmly in a crowded room, holding up the truth for everyone to see, and watching the bullies realize they're not nearly as powerful as they thought. In the end, the HOA didn't just lose control of my lake. They lost control of their docks, their authority, and their stranglehold on the neighborhood. And as for me, I got exactly what I had been searching for all along, peace by the water, in a home where the only thing I had to worry about was whether the fish were biting,